This is draft season presented by Moody's, a proud partner of the New York Giants. Decode risk, unlock opportunity, learn more at Moody's.com. I am John Schmelk, joined as always by Tony Pauline from Sportskeeda. Tony, good to talk to you, my friend. How are you?
Okay, very busy and interesting weekend of college football. We really saw the chaff separate from the wheat in that Texas Georgia game, which will be over. We saw some great play by some top-rated, some very good prospects, and some disappointing play by people who or players who projected to be early prospects.
Yeah, and Tony, it's funny. A couple weeks ago, we had Georgia lose to Alabama in that game, and people were
Yeah,
like, "Oh, Alabama, Georgia's falling off." Then Georgia comes back, blows out
yeah.
Texas. Alabama loses to Tennessee. I
And
mean,
Vanderbilt first. First they lose to Vanderbilt,
and
then they lose to Tennessee.
correct, and Vanderbilt, and it's almost hard to figure right now who the best team in college
Yeah.
football is.
I mean, Ohio State goes to Eugene, loses a close one to Oregon. What was their big first test of the year, and you got to wonder why Oregon isn't the number one rated team in the nation right now. But I mean, I was against this expanded college playoffs to 12 teams, but it's probably looking like it's a good thing because all these teams or most of these teams are going to go in there with one, maybe two losses.
Yeah, Tony, you took the words out of my mouth, right? It's not like this is the year where you can figure, all right, these are the two best teams, have them play, you're good. Even the four best teams, have them play, and we'll be
Yeah,
good. I think the worry when you went to 12 teams in this playoffs was that, the first couple rounds, you'd have the third best team play the 12th best team. It'd be a blowout and it
right.
wouldn't be competitive. But I don't know, man. Like, this is going to be a crazy few weeks as they sort through these top 12 teams.
And some of these teams still have some significant games left to play. Ohio State still has to play Penn State. They play Michigan. I don't think that's going to be much of a contest, but you never know. Oregon, you got some major matchups in the SEC moving forward. So there's still a lot of the story that's yet to be written.
Yeah, look, there's a lot of good teams in the SEC. Go from Ole Miss to LSU, even. They're going to make some noise. Texas, Alabama, Georgia. There's going to be big games in the SEC every single week.
But even Ole Miss has already got two losses.
Yeah.
I mean, lose to LSU, lose to Kentucky, and you got to. They did not have Alabama on the schedule this year. I checked that out. So, but they're basically on the cusp. Ole Miss cannot lose another game. It'd be interesting to see if they do. Do they let a team with three losses in the college football playoffs?
No question about it. So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out, but it'll be a lot of fun, good competitive games. And Tony, quite frankly, when you have a lot of good teams playing good teams, it's a good evaluation opportunity for us. And we had a
Yeah,
lot of those situations this week with some good games too.
great matchups. You see how players react. You see how they do when if they're from behind. You see which player really takes command. The momentum shifts, and that all is part of the evaluation process because that's what scouts are going to want to know about these players, and that's what they're going to ask them about. During combine interviews, which I'm sure we're going to get into.
Yeah, I mean, just go back to the CJ Stroud game a couple years ago, right, in the college football playoffs, and it really
Yeah.
changed a lot of opinions of the players. So there'll be a lot of those moments and opportunities for players to seize those spots. And then you're going to have some situations where players are asked to rise to the moment and they can't do it. And I think maybe that could be a good place to start here, Tony, because in this Texas Georgia game, I don't think either quarterback really,
No.
made a good argument to say, you know what, top 10 pick, let's roll. I'm your starter locked in. I'm your future quarterback. Both Quinn Ewers and Carson Beck had some issues in this game.
I expected what I got from Beck. He's a little bit inconsistent. He's a good pocket pass. He shows some accuracy, but he also makes mistakes. I think for Quinn Ewers, I never believed that he was a top 10 prospect. I've always said that if he's a first round prospect, he's a late first round prospect. And I think this was an opportunity for him to move the needle, and he didn't. I mean, I saw many of the same mistakes from Quinn Ewers that I have seen the past couple of years. He's late delivering the ball. He holds the ball too long. He stares down the primary target, and that ended up in him getting pulled and Arch Manning being put into the game because he really couldn't move that offense. So you're right. I mean, I think because of the size, because of the strength, if there's a guy that is maybe a top 10 of the two, it's going to be Carson Beck. But even Beck, I mean, like the Alabama game, he kind of digs his team into a hole. It's just that this time the Georgia defense had an answer early on where they didn't against Alabama. And while he makes some really incredible passes on occasion. He also makes some head scratching decisions, which turn into turnovers. And the one thing that, scouts are going to look at and teams are going to be very wary of, or should be, is ball protection. Can you protect the ball? Sam Darnold didn't do a good job of it at USC, and he struggled with it, in the early part of his career. So Carson Beck in these big games has really got to protect the ball. I think Quinn Ewers has got to be quicker with his decision making, got to be quicker, getting the ball out of his hands. He doesn't stare down got to stop staring down the primary target. Remember, Quinn Ewers was given third round grades by scouts coming into the season. So while everyone in the outside is touting him as a top 10 pick, we're here in New York. They're talking about, the Giants taking him with the first or second pick. It's never been like that within the scouting community. That's never been the opinion of viewers in the scouting community.
Yeah, and Tony, quite frankly, and we're not going to have the larger quarterback conversation today. We will do that down the road. I don't think there are any quarterbacks right now where teams are locked in, top 5 pick, lock and load. Like, you had 6 quarterbacks go in the top 12 last year, right? Half of the first 12 picks in last year's draft were quarterbacks. You might have one this year. Look, and things could change. Maybe Cam Ward lights it. We'll talk about him too. He'll light on fire. Maybe Jalen Milroe has a monster last 2 months and he jumps into that spot. But right now, it just is not, to me, a quarterback class with a bunch of guys like last year where you're looking at, top 5, top 10 selections.
And I think the reason is you don't see a lot of improvement from these guys. You see them making the same mistakes. I mean, Shedeur Sanders, for all his great playmaking ability, you just see poor fundamentals throwing the ball, which is not good. I mean, Jalen Milroe, we've talked about it before, and I'm a Jalen Milroe supporter. Just too much inconsistency, too much up and down play versus the Jaden Daniels from last year, who was always on the upswing, versus the Caleb Williams, who seemed to be able to pull a rabbit out of the hat when it was most needed. Even the Drake May, who, while he did not play well last year because he was getting the snot beat out of him at North Carolina, he stood in there and he competed and he didn't make the same mistakes. Or J.J. McCarthy. I mean, it wasn't great, but he did a great job, leading off. And
well, you Tony, saw Michael Penix. Even Michael Penix was great last year.
That's where I was going. I mean, you saw improvement from Michael Penix and Bo Nix. I don't see improvement, except for Cam Ward. I don't see a lot of improvement from this year's top guys.
Yeah, and even Ward has some issues with ball protection, right? And even his, some of his
ball across his body,
and some of his footwork stuff, right? And you have some, inaccuracy on some simple. I mean, I watched 2 full games of him this morning because I wanted to be ready to have that conversation, and we will get to the Miami game, Miami game a little bit later on here, but there's some simple slant routes where he just doesn't get his feet set. He's like doing this like sidearm sling. It's like 2 yards behind the receiver. Look, there are some things that you watch. You're like, oh man, he's rolling right, throwing 30 yards down the field as he get hit by a rusher. You're like, wow, that's a high end play. But then there are just some things where you scratch your head at some decision making. You look at the fundamentals and you're like, all right, he still has some work to do too.
And what happens is this is where the scouting process sometimes goes haywire, to the next level, because coaches will see that getting ready for the draft, and they say, we will coach that guy.
I can fix that, right?
Fundamentally. We will coach proper fundamentals. We know he can do this. We will be able to get him to do that. And a lot of times it doesn't work out at the quarterback position.
Yeah, and by the way, and again, we'll get to Ward. Just one last note on yours and Beck to me, Tony. I think with those 2 guys, maybe some of their lacking of improvement, the situation around those 2 guys aren't as good this year, right? Carson Beck, he doesn't have Ladd McConkey anymore. More importantly, he doesn't have Brock Bowers anymore, where you can dump a 3-yard pass and he runs 20 yards, right? Quinn Ewers doesn't have Adonai Mitchell. He doesn't have Xavier Worthy. He doesn't have Bijan Robinson. They don't have the same structure around them with these stars. And we're seeing, all right, well, if you don't have this super structure around you with a bunch of first-round picks, maybe you're not going to look quite as good, which, by the way, I think is good for the scouting process.
Right. And that's what happened with Caleb Williams last year, if you remember, because Caleb Williams lost Addison. He lost a bunch of talent around him, and he wasn't as good, but he still performed, and you still knew what you were getting with Caleb Williams. I think you don't, just to your point, you don't know what you're getting with a lot of these guys because they have not been able to perform at a high level despite the graduation of talent to the NFL.
Yeah, yours, by the way, just so fans have the stat line, 24, 40, 25 of 43, 211 yards, a pair of touchdowns, and Beck, 23 of 41, just 175 yards, 3 interceptions, no touchdowns in that game. You look at those two stat lines, you wonder how Georgia won the game. And then you get, oh, their defense just absolutely annihilated
Yeah.
the Texas Longhorns up front, which Tony, I think was a huge surprise because we had talked about how good this Longhorns offensive line had been.
Yeah.
Kelvin Banks, we talked about. They have another young player at the other offensive tackle spot that I know a lot of people were super high on. And Jalon Walker and Michael Williams said, not so fast.
I mean, Kelvin Banks just he looked pedestrian in this game. Yeah, Kelvin Banks, we talked about him, and I've talked about him as a potential top 10, top 12 pick. We spoke about him last show. People should go back about whether he's going to be a tackle or a guard and the reasons why. I mean, he looked like a mid-rounder at best. I thought the first sack that he gave up to Jalen Walker, I did think that Quinn Ewers held the ball a little bit too long, and that is when Texas had the ball deep in their own zone. But after that, I mean, Jalen Walker and Mikel Williams, I mean, made those guys look foolish, especially Jalen Walker. Jalen Walker finished with 8 tackles, 3 tackles for loss, 3 sacks. You know, he's getting the pressure. He's getting pressure on second down. And on third down, he's getting downfield, making plays in space. I've talked about Jalen Walker. I wrote about him over the summer at Sportskeeda. He was my week 1 riser, and his game just continues to take off. I was speaking with somebody yesterday about Kelvin Banks, and they said outright guard, guard, guard. And what's going to happen is, I talked earlier about those combine interviews. You better believe that Kelvin Banks next next February, March, when he's in Indianapolis, he's going to be grilled about this game when he goes into those meetings. You know, those confirmed meetings with those teams. They're going to ask him, you know, what happened against Georgia? Why did you play so poorly? I mean, it was that bad of a game for Kelvin Banks, who, well, you don't want to, you're not going to downgrade a guy because of one game. You want to see him rebound. It's definitely a question that's going to be asked of him.
Right now, if I had to ask you, Tony, who gets drafted first, Jalon Walker or Michael Williams?
I'm going to say, well, we got to know, we got to find out the height, weight, and speed of these guys because they're underclassmen. I mean, Walker looks a little bit smaller. I like Walker because I like the versatility of his game, the fact that he is a terrific pass rusher, the fact that he's a good run defender in pursuit, the fact that he can play in space. But if Mikel Williams, you know, has great measurables, tests off the roof, I could see him being selected earlier.
And then
And he's got a larger body of work because remember last year Jalen Walker was basically a rotational linebacker at Georgia. He wasn't a consistent starter.
Yeah, it's funny, you know, at Georgia they have such a factory where they just manufacture these great defensive players where they're sitting on the bench. You don't know what you have until they're given an opportunity. Like, oh, that guy's a monster. Who knew? And then offensively, you know, we mentioned Carson Beck's struggle, but you were once again impressed by Trevor Etienne. 19 rushes, 87 yards, 3 touchdowns, 3 catches as well.
Really carried that Georgia offense early on in that game when Carson Beck couldn't get a movement, was turning the ball over. They turned to Etienne. And, you know, his instincts, his ability to create yardage, the ability to pick and choose his spots on the inside and basically weave through the defenders. I mean, there's a guy who got suspended early on, had some injury issues, really rounding into form. I thought he did a terrific job against what is a pretty solid Texas defense.
I should tease, by the way, what's coming up later on in the show. I did not do that. I probably should. Tony's going to go through his small school prospects today. So maybe some guys on day 3. Maybe one might get into day 2 here that we're going to talk about today. So that's coming up later. Tony's really good. You'll learn some names that you haven't heard before, the non-Power 5 guys and guys in even smaller conferences than that. So make sure you stay tuned. As after we get through these games, Tony will go through his small school guys. Moody's is a proud partner of the New York Giants, uniting the brightest minds to turn today's risks into tomorrow's opportunities. Learn more at moodys.com. All right, Tony, let's go to game number 2 you want to focus on today. Miami and Louisville, we already kind of talked about Cam Ward in your notes here. I agree, you know, you're impressed by his vision, Ward's patience. You know, he just looks so relaxed in the pocket. Yeah. He never looks stressed out. And everything comes naturally. You talk about arm talent, and I know by that you don't just mean arm strength. It's his ability to throw creatively, right? It's all those different arm angles and stuff like that. And it shows up, and he has some crazy throws, But in the same, I watched his first two games this morning. They don't have the all 22 ready for the Miami Louisville game yet, and you talk about him holding the ball too long. I agree. And sometimes when he gets rushed, he'll run backwards against pressure, which is always a big no-no for quarterbacks. You can't do that. But again, a very productive game, 21 to 32, 319 yards and 4 touchdowns.
Yeah, ask Zach Wilson about running backwards in the NFL when you're being when you're being pressured. The thing that really impressed me about Ward in this game is he always has an answer, and it was like that in the Virginia Tech game. Whenever Miami was down, whenever the game was close, he gets on the field, he leads the team down the field for a score. He always seems to have an answer. We talked about Quinn Ewers. Quinn Ewers did not have an answer against Georgia. Carson Beck really, he really didn't have an answer. It was ATN, it was that defense. Cam Ward, whether it was against Louisville, whether it was the prior game against Virginia Tech, he always has an answer. He comes out, and when the team needs a big drive, he gets them down the field into the end zone, or the field goal kicker comes out and kicks it through the uprights. That is what really impressed me. Miami was up early. Then the game was close, and it's almost he doesn't carry this offense on his shoulders because they have other talented players, which we'll talk about. But he always, he finds a way to get the job done. And again, we talked about the combine interviews earlier. That's something that's going to be talked about with Ward in depth, as will be, his bad fundamentals and throwing across the body and not throwing a proper footwork. But they're going to talk about his mindset, getting on the field when Miami needs a big drive, and he delivers. Granted, it's the ACC, so it's not a Georgia defense. It's not an LSU defense, but still, the guy has always delivered when Miami needed it multiple times within games this year, which is just so impressive.
And one thing I like too, he throws with a lot of anticipation, Tony. He'll throw to guys before they're even out of their breaks as receivers. Right. So, and one of those guys he's throwing to is Xavier Restrepo, who continues to be productive. 7 catches, 101 yards, and a touchdown, Tony.
Not really big, not really fast, but he runs good routes. He separates through his routes, which, is as important these days in the NFL as a guy who runs 4.3s, and he catches everything in sight. There was a touchdown pass, I believe, was late in the third quarter. I may need to be corrected on that. It was just a phenomenal pass by Ward and an equally phenomenal catch by Restrepo, who went up for the fade pattern, contorted, played with great balance and body control, made the catch to really seal the game for Miami. I think he's going to be a day 3 pick. The faster he runs, the earlier he'll be drafted, but I don't think he's a guy who's going to run any faster than a 4.49 in that area. But still, I think he's going to be a very good number 5, potentially number 4 receiver at the next level who's got some return skills.
Remember, do you know look, I have not watched him yet, Tony, aside from watching him on TV. The way you describe him reminds me a lot of Amon-Ra St. Brown, who did not test particularly well, not the biggest guy, but he just knows how to play wide receiver. Is that a decent comparison, or do you think he's a different type of player?
No, size as well. Yeah, absolutely. And St. Brown went later in the draft than I think people initially thought, but it's turned out to be a real good NFL receiver.
And by the way, one other thing on Ward I want to point out too, Tony, this is his 5th year. We saw last year older quarterbacks have some success, so I think NFL teams might want to err towards the guys that have a little bit more playing experience too, which is something that might be working in Ward's favor here. They're 2 running backs. Mark Fletcher, 13 rushes, 73 yards, and then Damian Martinez at 12 for 89 and a touchdown.
Well, the thing I pointed out is because, Martinez was one of the prize transfers to Miami along with Cam Ward, and he's a great running back. And he goes there, and they got a sophomore by the name of Fletcher who was taking carries away from him. And you look early in the game, it was Fletcher who was carrying the ball for Miami, doing a great job. They bring Damian Martinez in, and if you watched any of the runs from Damian Martinez, you can't tackle him. I mean, he was carrying that Louisville defense was trying to gang tackle him, and he's carrying them for 5 yards, breaking tackles left and right. And he's not just a big-bodied, say, Braylon Allen type of back. He's got excellent quickness. He's got an excellent burst. It's going to be interesting because you think that with a huge season, Damian Martinez would make a move up draft boards and be one of the top 3 or 4 backs, after Jeanty, after ATN. But, it could be a situation where he doesn't have that much film this year, and teams will say, well, listen, his workload wasn't that big this year. He didn't have 250 carries. So we know there's still a lot of tread left on the tires. And when he was in there, he was incredibly productive, as he was Saturday against Louisville. So it's kind of an interesting which ways it's going to go, because Martinez came into the season with very high grades. He came into the season with second round grades. When he's on the field, he plays like a day two prospect. It's just that Miami has so many backs in the stable there. He's being used in a rotational sort of situation rather than a feature runner. It'll be interesting. Did they downgrade him because he wasn't the feature runner at Miami? Or did they say, you know what? Whenever he got the ball, he showed, what he's capable of, and he didn't have 250 carries last year, so there's a lot of tread left on the tire.
And at his size, he's a guy you would want to see grind down the opposition, right? But he's only getting 11 or 12 carries a game. It's hard to grind down the opposition, which is kind of what you mentioned. It's 78 carries in 7 games. You're not grinding anybody down, carrying it 10 times a game. So, yeah, interesting usage there. A couple other players, Tony, you want to mention from this game, from Louisville and from Miami.
Yeah, I mean, Corey Thornton was a highly rated defensive back. Had a terrible game. Gave up a bad touchdown in the second quarter. Ashton Gillott, I mean, this guy has fallen off the face of the earth.
We loved him last year. I mean, I think last year we thought he could have been a day 2 pick.
Good reason to love him. Good reason to love him last year. Last year, 45 tackles, 14 and a half tackles for loss, 11 sacks, could not be stopped, had 2 tackles against Miami. This year, I think it was 6 or 7 games, 18 tackles, 2 sacks. Ashton Gillott comes out of enters the 2024 NFL draft. He is a 3rd round pick, maybe a 4th round pick. He's now playing like a 6th or 7th round prospect. So, where is Ashton Gillott? And I liked him. I gave him actually a 2nd round grade after doing my film work over the summer. Granted, there's questions about his size. Is he a defensive end? Is he a defensive tackle? Is he a 3 technique guy? That doesn't matter because he's been nowhere this year.
Did Louisville change defensive coordinators or anything like that? I'm obviously not following Louisville closely. Have they changed their system, or is it just he just hasn't been as productive?
I don't know because it's the same head coach, and I know they had a relatively successful year last year, and but and I looked, and there weren't any major injuries that seemed to be seemed to be holding a lot back. So, but again, you got to produce. And then the one other guy from Louisville got to mention is Tyler Show, the quarterback. 31 of 51 against Miami, 4 touchdown passes. The guy's a 7th-year senior. He was a guy who 6 years ago, looked like a phenom as a freshman at Oregon, then made the people thought was the mind-boggling decision to transfer to Texas Tech. His career has been marred with inconsistency and injury, or his career at Texas Tech was marred with inconsistency and injury. He's played relatively well at Louisville. And I mean, he's a guy who's got all the physical skills. He goes 6'4", 240 pounds. He's athletic. He can make all the throws, but he's an older guy as a 7th-year senior. He seems to be getting his game back to where it was 5 years ago when he was a sophomore at Oregon, and everyone was all excited about him. The age, the injuries, prior inconsistency, it's going to be an interesting evaluation which show, see if he's invited to any of the postseason games, the Shrine Game, the Senior Bowl, how he does there. But he seems to he seems to have gotten his game back to where it was, and there's some excitement about his game, but there's also some concern.
Yeah, I mean, that's the COVID year. That's injury red shirts. That's all the extra stuff. That 7 years. I mean, my goodness. He's got to be 25, 26 years old, right?
I would imagine. Yeah, got to. He's 25 years old now.
That's crazy. Alabama, Tennessee. I'm sure there's a little panic right now in the ways of Alabama there, Tony. And there are probably people calling Nick Saban like, hey, man, you want to make a return here? No. Jalen Milroe. And again, I think this is a situation you don't want to put him in, Tony, where you're putting the whole game on his shoulders. 25 of 45, 239 yards, a couple of picks, 1 touchdown. And again, Alabama losing to Tennessee after losing to Vanderbilt, a rough couple of weeks coming off that big win against Georgia.
Except for that late drive against Georgia, we haven't seen from Jalen Milroe what we've seen from Cam Ward, in the sense that when they need the big drive, when they need to answer the opponent, Jalen Milroe really hasn't been able to do it. And there's a lot of inconsistency there. And, that's going to be the red flag with Jalen Milroe. There's some concern about his downfield accuracy, although his downfield arm, in my opinion, is incredible. Again, like Shedeur Sanders, like Carson Beck, like Quinn Ewers, just don't see that improvement on a week-to-week basis from Jalen Milroe. He seems to be kind of stuck in the middle there. And every time you get excited, like he did the first half of Georgia, he comes back with a game against Vanderbilt. He comes back with a inconsistent effort against Tennessee.
Yeah, and Tony, I'll be honest with you. We saw what the board did with 2 years of Michael Penix in Washington. I know Jalen Milroe, people are going to tell him you could be a late first round pick, a second round pick, come out. I think he'd be wise to stay in school for one more year and try to continue to develop, to be honest with you. Now, things might change in the next 2 months and he might end up, taking off like a rocket ship. But right now, that would be my advice to him at least.
And, with the dynamic freshman receiver there, with
Yep.
NIL money, out the roof, it would be a lot easier to keep him this year or for next season, than it's been in the past.
Another running back to talk about here, Tony. I think it's showing what a good running back class this is going to be. There's a lot of good players. Dylan Sampson, another big game, 26 carries, 139 yards, and a pair of touchdowns. I think we either talked about him last week or the week before.
You did, yeah, exactly. And I watched him this week. Very explosive, runs with authority, hits the hole, has terrific playing speed, as Tennessee running backs usually do. We saw that last year with Wright, a guy who can beat defenders into the open field, a guy who could run through tackles. He's got to improve his running around the perimeter, but a high energy back for a team that likes to run the ball, also likes to throw the ball. So Sampson is a guy to keep an eye on.
All right, let's go to LSU, Arkansas, Tony. And you're impressed with Will Campbell, someone you've been a little tough on, but you were very happy with his performance against Arkansas.
Either I've been wrong about Will Campbell all season long, or somebody said to Will Campbell, you better get out there and lit a fire into Will Campbell, because the Will Campbell I saw against Arkansas was not the guy I saw early in the season. He was a guy who was working to finish blocks. He was a guy who was stout at the point in pass protection. I mean, Landon Jackson, who was the big-time Arkansas pass rusher,
good player.
5 tackles. 5 tackles, no sacks. Arkansas as a team had no sacks and had just 1 tackle for loss. Will Campbell looked like the guy I hoped he would look like against Arkansas. Still's got to improve his playing strength and learn to finish blocks, but he wasn't not finishing because of lack of effort. He was out there every down looking to finish off the opponent. I thought his pass protection skills were outstanding. Good job by Will Campbell. After I've been beating him down the past couple of weeks.
Yeah. Well, in a couple of weeks, we'll have a larger quarterback conversation, Tony. But what do you think of Nussmeier? He's shown me a little something this year. I think he's got a little moxie to him. Obviously, he doesn't have a ton of playing experience at this point. What's the chance if LSU can make a little bit of a run here and maybe get into the college playoff and make some noise, that Nussmeier could be knock on the door of a potential top 3 quarterback this year?
Top 3, I think it's a bit early. He's got a good arm. He makes some nice passes, a little bit of inconsistency there. I think he's a good developmental guy. I think he's more of a day 3 guy who's got to really improve his overall game. He's got the underlying skills, though.
Yes, I'm with you. I think he's a guy that should probably go back for another year, to be honest with you, and try to develop and get another year under his belt. I'm with you. All right. So that's the games from the weekend. A lot to talk about there. Draft season is presented by Moody's. Moody's is a proud partner of the New York Giants. Decode risk, unlock opportunity. Learn more on Moody's.com. All right, Tony, I teased this earlier. Let's get into some of the small school prospects. And one guy that jumps out to you, and it's funny, I come across some tape of him earlier this week as well, and I was very impressed. Big Charles Grant, William and Mary offensive lineman.
Well, I think we'll start off by when you talk about the small school prospects this year, you basically, most of them, the top guys, are coming from 2 conferences, the Big Sky and the CAA, the Colonial Athletic Association. The Missouri Valley, which is North Dakota State, not too many prospects come out of there, especially at the top. And it's an offensive-heavy board. A lot of offensive linemen, including Charles Grant, and a lot of skilled players, especially running backs. Now, Charles Grant, if you remember, you go back to the show we had with Jim Nagy, I asked him about him because Charles Grant was sort of the flavor of the summer. I mean, everyone was calling him, what do you think of Charles Grant at William & Mary? Talked to him about scouts, talked with him about him with scouts, talked about him with agents. and I really didn't do all that much film work until the end of the summer. He plays left tackle for William and Mary. He goes 6'4.5". He's listed at 292 pounds. People tell me he's only 285 pounds, but he's incredibly athletic. He is the prototypical zone blocker. If you watch William and Mary film, they will occasionally line him up as an H-back in their backfield and pull him across the line of scrimmage to use him blocking in motion, and he gets the job done. He's mobile, he's agile, he's light on his feet. The only thing is he's not strong. 285, 290 pounds. He even he struggles finishing off linebackers. So that is going to be the red flag on the Charles Grant's game. But teams love him. The scouts absolutely love him. They see the size, they see the growth potential, 6'4.5". They figure he's going to easily be able to put on 20 to 25 more pounds. They look at the athleticism and the movement skills, and that's what they love about Charles Grant. I think about Ali Marpet, the former Hobart offensive lineman who went to the Senior Bowl, blew it up, became a second-round choice. He is sort of in that same mold, although Marpet was even shorter. Like Marpet, Grant blocks with solid fundamentals. I think he's going to be a terrific zone blocking guard. I already have him on my guard board, but that is far and away Charles Grant of William and Mary, the top small school prospect moving towards the 2025 draft.
Well, let me follow up just for a question with you, Tony. Why can't he play tackle, do you think? If he's that athletic, light on his feet, you have written down here that you've read or heard that he runs a 4.89 40, which for an offensive lineman is off the charts. Is arm length going to be a problem for him?
I just think the strength is going to be an issue for him early on. I mean, but you never know. I mean, last year, if you remember the Yale kid, Kieran Arjamade, he was drafted in the third round, and he basically didn't play any football from mid-October on because of a torn thigh muscle, and he's projected, or he's on the Bears depth chart as a left tackle. Yeah. I just think until he gets stronger. I mean, watch the film. He struggles finishing blocks, which is why I like him at guard. I think he's the kind of guy at this point that needs a running start into his blocks, if you will. Yeah, and that's a lot easier done at offensive guard than tackle.
You have a couple other offensive linemen on your list here as well, Tony, and one from, not surprisingly, North Dakota State.
Well, let's go with Jackson Slater first. There's Jackson Slater of Sacramento State. He's sort of the polar opposite of Charles Grant in the sense that he's more of a power gap sort of lineman, 6'3", 313 pounds, shows some sneaky athleticism, but he is a nasty masher, punchy in your face type of guy. He gets movement run blocking. He turns the defenders off the line. He's not stiff. He's not mobile. Kind of reminds me of a guy we spoke about last week, Mason McCormick, who's now starting at offensive guard for the Pittsburgh Steelers in the sense that he's a strong guy. He's a strong run blocker, but he's not a liability on his feet. The kid you mentioned from North Dakota State, Gray Zabel, 6'5.5", 304 pounds, lays left tackle. I think he's going to be a guard. Doesn't show that great footwork. Early on this year, I think the first game of the year, North Dakota State played Colorado, and Zabel did a phenomenal job against the Buffalo defenders. Personally project him as a 6th-round choice. I'm sure we're going to be seeing him in the postseason. But you got a variety of players here. You got Charles Grant, who's a zone blocker. You got Jackson Slater, who's more of a power gap guy. You got Gray Zabel, who's a little bit mix of both. And all those guys are draftable prospects.
You got some running backs on your list here, Tony. And I always think running backs from smaller schools have a real chance because if the instincts are there, as long as the measurables are good enough, you can translate from a smaller school to the NFL at running back.
Land Larson, and the first two guys I'm talking about, Land Larson and Marcus Yarns. Land Larson of UC Davis, the school that produced a guy by the name of Ken O'Brien, and Marcus Yarns from Delaware. They're both your situational third down back types. I mean, Land Larson this year, 171 carries, 821 yards, 7 touchdowns, 39 receptions, 524 yards, 5 TDs. You watch Larson, he's creative, he's quick, he's elusive, he knows how to avoid defenders. He's a terrific pass catcher out of the backfield. 5'10.5", 209 pounds, probably going to run a low 4.5s. Going to be at one of the postseason All-Star games, possibly the Senior Bowl, so we'll be able to see him against top competition there. He's a 5th, 6th round prospect who will be playing on Sunday as a situational third down back.
By the way,
Marcus
Tony,
Short,
I know you call him a third down back, but 209
right,
pounds, that's pretty
right.
good. Like 209 pounds for a running back, that's a guy that at least should have the size to not just be a guy that can catch balls out of the backfield.
Well, yeah, and third down back, you can also hand them off the ball on 3rd as well. I just don't think he's going to be a feature runner. He is a productive. He's a terrific ball carrier. So I'm not trying to diminish him in any way by that. I just think that he's better on the rotational level, rotational role. Marcus Yarns has struggled with the injuries this year. He's a little bit smaller, Marcus Yarns, 5'10" and a half, 185 pounds, 4.45 speed. 939 yards and 15 TDs last year, 24 receptions. He is your prototypical third down back in the sense that he needs space to work. He's not a guy, if you watch him, he's easily tackled at the point, but he's incredibly elusive. He's a very creative ball carrier. He's feisty. The injuries have kind of set him back. I was hoping to see some progress in his game, but he's been on the sidelines a little bit. But again, he's your guy. You really want to get him the ball in space. And then the third running back is Elijah Tolliver, who's actually an underclassman. He's also from Sacramento State, like Jackie Slater. Reminds me of Javonte Williams. This year in 6 games, 726 yards, 6 TDs, has that sort of, forward lean, go straight ahead, run through tackles. No one can tackle him, but also has got excellent quickness. Only an underclassman. I highly doubt he's going to enter the draft, but he's a guy to keep an eye on moving forward.
All right, then you have somewhat local to the Northeast, Villanova, a DB,
Yeah.
huh? That you like.
Isis Waxter. I have a 6th-round grade on him. Scouts coming in the season had a 5th-round grade on him. 6'1" and a half, 208 pounds, 4.53. Terrific instincts, physical, feisty, fires up the field defending running plays or screen throws. Solid cover man when he's facing the ball. He really struggles making plays with his back to the ball. He's played cornerback. I think he could ultimately be moved to safety because he's so good facing the ball, and he really struggles with his back to the ball. Plus, you look at that size, 6'1" and a half, 208 pounds, and his playing style. He's either going to be his own cornerback or he could be a safety.
All right, and then let's go to the offensive side of the ball, some wide receivers that you like.
Yeah, Efton Chisholm, a kid from Eastern Washington. He's all over the board as far as scouts are concerned. Some scouts say priority free agent. Some scouts say street free agent. I think he's a late round pick. 5'10" and a half, 198 pounds. The speed is going to be an issue because he was a 4.55 guy. The production is off the charts. You can't stop this guy. 7 games this year, 69 receptions, 750 yards. Last year, 84 receptions for 932 yards.
Wow.
The guy, he's uncoverable. His route running is incredible. I mean, you're talking about scissor sharp routes, like some of those guys we saw at the Shrine game last year that the defensive backs could not cover them because they were so quick in and out of routes. That's what Chisholm is, and he's an exceptional pass catcher. Extends his hands, makes the catch away from his frame. He doesn't shy down from battle either. I mean, he will get up in the crowd and come down with the ball, which is why his production is so great. The only thing about Chisholm is I think that it's the 40 time that can hurt him, that will push him deep in the draft, maybe push him out of the draft. But if you're looking for a slot receiver, a number 5 receiver, a return specialist, I mean, Chisholm is your guy because he's just a natural football player, a naturally skilled pass catcher who, just always gets the job done. And, opposing defenses know the ball is going to him and they can't stop him.
Do you want to hit Elijah Pondy here, Tony, and just get the wide receivers out of the way? I'm sorry. Do you want to hit Jared Gibson here and get the wide receivers out of the way?
Yeah, Sac State actually has 2 receivers, Jared Gibson and Anderson Grover. Gibson is a little bit bigger. Gibson is a little bit faster. Grover's a little bit smaller. They're both really possession type receivers who, again, catch everything in sight. They occasionally show some big playability, but it's the reliability factor that I think why these guys could, slide into the late part of the draft, the very late part, the 7th round. Gibson goes 5'11" and a half, 204 pounds, 4.55, but he's a terrific pass catcher.
Now you have to wrap us up here with the small school guys, Tony. We have a linebacker / edge guy, and it's tough sometimes with the height, weight, speed that you want out of these guys from smaller schools to make it. A lot of these guys, and I'll have one more wrap-up question for you, but you like Elijah Ponder from Cal Poly, 6'2", 251 pounds, a fifth-year senior.
Scouts gave him a draftable grade coming in the season. I have a 7th-round grade on him. You watch him play. He primarily comes out of a three-point stance, though he will occasionally stand over tackle. 28 tackles, 8.5 tackles for loss, and 5 sacks in 7 games this year. Last year, 13 tackles for loss and 10 sacks. One of those guys who was a smaller college defensive end edge rusher that has the athleticism and has shown the ability to play off the line in space on zone blitzes or things like that. 6'2.5", 251 pounds, expected to run under 4.7. Going to be a late round pick. I would expect we're going to see him in the postseason at the Shrine or the Senior Bowl. Can rush the passer, can do a variety of things. And I think that's why he cements himself as a 7th-round choice.
With the transfer portal, Tony, and we'll wrap things up here, has it been much tougher for you to find small school guys because guys just tend to transfer a lot more and don't stay at some of these smaller schools like Quinion Mitchell did at Toledo?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what happens is your smaller conference guys from the MAC and the American Conference go to the bigger conferences because that's where the money is. And then what happens is those smaller conference guys dip into Division I AA, Division II, and take the guys out. So, it's kind of a thinning from not only Division I AA, but also those smaller conferences like the MAC and the AAA, because everyone's going in there to raid the talent now that, they're paying out the NIL deals. So absolutely.
Tony, good stuff, my friend. And you're off to Ohio State next week, right? You going to do some in-person scouting?
Visit my daughter. I will be at the Ohio State-Nebraska game Saturday afternoon and run to a bar to watch the rest of the games.
Draft season is presented by Moody's. Moody's is a proud partner of the New York Giants, uniting the brightest minds to turn today's risk into tomorrow's opportunities. Learn more at Moody's.com. For Tony Pauline at Sportskeeda, I am John Schmelk. That's draft season. We'll be back with you next week. Same bat time, same bat channel. We'll see you then.